For Unit 3, the Unit 3 topic is cultural patterns and processes. So when we did Unit 3, we covered chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7 in our textbook. So it's kind of the largest chunk of textbook, but it is just one unit. So it focuses on just culture, race and ethnicity, and language, and religion, as well as gender. All right, so for our Unit 3 overview, we are going to be, there are kind of 8 different sections of Unit 3. Today we're going to talk about 3.1 through 3.3. And then tomorrow we'll talk about types of diffusion and the effects of diffusion, and then so on and so forth. So this is how we'll kind of break it down for the week: Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. All right, so Monday's topics. We have 3.1, which is our introduction to culture. And so we'll talk a little bit about what is culture, cultural traits, and then the concepts of cultural relativism versus ethnocentrism. Something that's not in your textbook, however, it should be in your AMSCO review book if you need some extra help with that. But we did talk about it in class. We'll also talk about the concept of cultural landscapes and then cultural patterns, particularly language, religion, ethnicity, and gender. All right, so our first topic is just the introduction to culture. And so 3.1 just kind of introduces the concept of culture. And it says that culture is a combination of shared practices, technologies, attitudes, behaviors that are transmitted by society. Now, we do need to remember that culture is very fluid. It is something that people can define themselves as. A culture can exist within a group of people that see themselves as having a similar ancestry or a similar history, but it also can be comprised by people that see themselves as similar in other ways, like a high school culture or a smaller subset of a culture. And so culture is very much cannot just be defined as one thing, which makes it difficult for some of us to really understand exactly what culture is. But if you take a look over here at this culture wheel, it kind of gives you some ideas of things that would fit into culture. Cultural traits then are things that include things like food preferences, the architecture that societies use, the land use patterns, and once again, anything that you kind of see over here. And culture, once again, is ever changing, and people fit into many different cultures at the same time. The second part of 3.1 is kind of the two opposing views of culture. And on the one hand, the ethnocentrist or the ethnocentrism is the practice of judging another's culture. So this whole concept is, how do we view other cultures? So people that we don't consider to be part of their culture or their group. And in ethnocentrism way, that would be the practice of judging another culture by the standard of your own. So if we just break down that term, ethno, which probably is the kind of prefix for ethnicity, but if you think about ethno as in terms of ethnography or culture, it's putting your culture at the center. So that's where we get that centrism. So anytime you see that a term that is something centrism, it's putting your view. So a heliocentric world would be that the sun is the center of the universe, for example. And the ethnocentrism way leads to a belief in the superiority of your own ethnic group, your own racial group, your own religious or cultural custom or practice. And ethnocentrism has led to racism, feelings of it was a driving force behind the colonial period, where people believed that they had the right to take over other groups of people because they were superior to them and other groups were inferior. But it also even just leads to feelings that what other people do, the way in which other people do things, is wrong. So it has, it kind of has the whole scale of things. I'm sure we are all at fault of having ethnocentric beliefs at different times, but there's large scale of those types of things. So the opposite end of the spectrum is the cultural relativism view of the world or view of other cultures. So it's the practice of judging another culture by its own standards. putting aside your own cultural preferences. So instead of taking your biases, your attitudes into the situation, viewing other people's cultures as something that we can't judge because we all come in with our own culture, and judging other cultures by their own standards. So, that may not be how I do things, but I can understand why people might do it that way. All right, so 3.2 is cultural landscapes. Cultural landscape is really just the human imprint on the landscape. And so it includes a whole bunch of different things. And these are kind of a list of different things the cultural landscape would be included. It is common for a culture FRQ question to include a photo or to include a picture where you may need to analyze the cultural landscape. So cultural landscapes include physical features. They also include agricultural and industrial practices. They include religious and linguistic characteristics, so religion and language. Sequent occupancy or sequent occupants. This is a term you should go back over and make sure that you understand. But it really just means that a landscape or a cultural landscape in an area has been affected by multiple groups of people that have had power over that region over time. So it's kind of like layers upon layers. And so in the textbook, they use the example of a region that has some traditional native landscapes, but then has some colonial landscapes and then the influence of the Indian migrants. And so there are patterns that come upon the landscape from subsequent occupants. So sequent occupants would be people, various groups of people that have all put their imprint on that landscape. Traditional and postmodern architecture, and then land use patterns. So a lot of this, you'll notice, has some cross-reference to other units. So like agriculture, and we'll talk about land use patterns again when we come back to agriculture, and then industrial practices, which is our economic unit. Cultural landscapes will show us the attitudes of society towards gender and ethnicity. And so they might show us, or they would be reflective of the role of women in the workplace. Ethnic neighborhoods would be an example of the ethnic imprint on the landscape. And then the indigenous communities and the land that has either been given to them or has helped shape that given society. All right, 3.3 is the last topic for today, cultural patterns. Regional patterns of language, religion, and ethnicity contribute to a sense of place. They enhance placemaking and shape global cultural landscapes. So a sense of place, once again, is just this concept that we make sense out of our world, out of our space, and we give it meaning. And placemaking is the way in which human beings make those places, the way that they alter those places, the way that they give those places meaning. Okay, so some examples here of how language, religion, ethnicity have all influenced the placemaking or the sense of place. This is a sign in Quebec, which is all in French. And there has been some backlash from English speakers in Quebec to change some of the signs to be bilingual, French and English. But the laws in Quebec say that all signage has to be in French. And so what they compromised in doing is adding more pictures to signs so that people who are non-French speaking can interpret them. This is a Buddhist pagoda in Japan, showing the religious landscape. And this is an ethnic neighborhood in New Jersey that is predominantly Indian. So you see festivals, and you see Bombay Beauty Parlor, and you see some examples of Indian culture. And then the last topic is the language, still cultural patterns, but language, ethnicity, and religion are factors that create centripetal and centrifugal forces. So this will come up again in political, but a centripetal force is a force that unifies the people, and a centrifugal force is a force that divides people. So you'll be asked in your concepts assignment or potentially in your discussion post for today about how does language issues, ethnicity, and religion unify people, and how does it divide people? And so when we talk about countries that are monolingual, have a single language, that might be an example of a centripetal force. Diversity and conflict related to diversity can be considered to be centrifugal force. However, diversity and multiculturalism can also be a centripetal force. People can embrace that. And so there's lots of different ways that these contribute, and it's not necessarily always just one way or the other. All right, so that's Monday. Tuesday, we'll talk about these topics of diffusion.